The dismissive avoidant person really learns to live life on their own little island. They are very uncomfortable with conflict. They're very slow to warm up to other people. They don't trust other people because they learned that.
Caring for others is part of your life, but it's not all of it. This is your space for growth, confidence, and connection to the whole you. Welcome to the DaliTalks podcast. Welcome back to the DaliTalks podcast. My guest today is Bev Mitelman. She's a certified relationship and attachment trauma practitioner. She's also a certified menopause specialist and founder of Securely Loved. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you and your audience. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for agreeing to come on and talk about this topic because it's really important. I mean, you have so much wealth of knowledge. And one of the things I want to ask about is how you got into learning about attachment and how that can, impact people's lives. Because I think right now, the topic of attachment in relationships, most people think about it in a romantic relationship standpoint, but it's not so, right? So tell us a little bit about how you got into this.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So what's so interesting is that your attachment style, which is really the way in which you form an emotional bond with someone else, it gets formed really early in your childhood, depending on the type of interactions that you experienced, you saw, you felt, you heard really early on. And the impact that it has on you is, like you mentioned, when you grow into adulthood, it impacts how you form emotional bonds or relationships with all sorts of other people, romantic partners, but also family members, right? Your parents, your kids, if you have colleagues, neighbors, friends, especially close friends. And so people don't realize that your attachment style or the way in which you would form that emotional bond is really pervasive throughout your life. And it has a massive impact also on the level of trust that you first and foremost afford yourself and that you afford others as well. So I know that your work very much focuses around parents and helping younger adults or adolescents, even kids, sort of learn how to interact in a friendly, in a kind, in a considerate way, right? So attachment styles are so important to this group because oftentimes when kids are acting out, kids don't have the ability for critical thought. That skill is developed later on in all humans. And so oftentimes they don't even know why they're acting out. And it usually has more to do with an issue of something going on in the house and the relationship that the kid has to that the kid has to the parents, which parents are not going to want to hear, right? Because parents are going to think that, oh, she's blaming me. My kid is acting out, so I'm to blame. It's not a blame game, but what we're about to dive into is a lot about our behaviors and emotions and thoughts that are held in our subconscious mind, meaning we're not consciously aware of these things. And so our work as people, as parents, as friends, as romantic partners, as a community is to educate ourselves, is to make this stuff become more part of our conscious awareness so we can make more conscious choices around our behavior vis-a-vis others.
I really find this topic really fascinating because when I learned of is it four different types?
Yes.
I always say self-evaluate. That's just a thing that I do. And then I started
Most people.
thinking, yeah, and I
Yeah.
started thinking, oh my gosh, what is my style? And is it possible for me to have different styles all at once? And how, like, because I was bullied as a kid. And then I also, I'm looking at all of my different relationships and what I accepted from some people or what I refused to accept from other people, and that played into it. So, can you give us a little rundown of the four styles? And is there a good quiz that we can use to evaluate or get an idea of what we could be as far as attachment style.
Yeah, I'm smiling because there is a good quiz. There's a quiz on my website at securelyloved.com. Right on the homepage. It's called the attachment quiz. You answer a couple of questions and it'll give you an idea of where you fit into those four different boxes. Now, I'll try to briefly go over what those four styles are, but there's some depth to them. So, we'll go in a little bit, but essentially, there's two broad categories when we're talking about attachment styles. So, first to say, everyone in this world has an attachment style. It's just a way in which we form an emotional bond and or the strategies that we use to protect ourselves when we feel emotionally threatened. That's where we see this most, right? So there's two broad categories of styles. One is called a securely attached person, and the other is an unsecure or insecure attached person. Okay. Now, within the insecure attached box, there are three subcategories. It's like a continuum, a spectrum. So when you're insecurely attached, you can go in one of three different ways. You could be dismissive, avoidant.
Mhm.
You can be anxious, preoccupied, or you could have traits from both of those buckets and fall somewhere in the middle, sort of like a mixed bag, like what you were describing, which is called the fearful avoidant, also called disorganized attachment.
Oh, okay.
So if you count all those, that comes to four: secure attachment, dismissive avoidant, anxious, preoccupied, fearful avoidant. Those are the four. So in North America, we say that about 40 to 50% of the population is predominantly securely attached. Now that number, sways a little bit back and forth, but I like to use 50% just sort of as like a guide, right? Which means that the other 50% of our population of adults has an insecure attachment, right? Just to give you a sense.
Right.
So, someone who has a secure attachment grew up in a home, in broad strokes, where they received a fair deal of emotional attunement, predictability, and safety from their caregivers, which meant that they were taught about their emotions. Their parents were generally emotionally regulated. It is not that the parents never made a mistake. It is not that the parents, never got upset about things or yelled. We all do, right? We all have thresholds for when, our nervous system says enough, right? So this is not about perfection. What it is that it's a template whereby the child felt that they were safe and could predict how the caregiver would interact with them in a pretty consistent way, right? So if the child was upset, they were consoled, they were comforted, they were given space to have their feelings, they were taught about emotional regulation, right? Children who are taught, for example, it's okay to be angry. Tell me why you're angry. It's not okay to slam the door and throw your shoes,
Mhm.
right? That is not behavior that's acceptable in the home. But it's okay to be angry. And what can we, here are some of the things that I do when I'm angry. I go for a walk, that helps me. I listen to music, that helps me. Children who learn these strategies really early on, they grow up into adults who are generally pretty stable, who have good life skills. And when the time comes for them to become romantic partners themselves, they do very well in romantic partnerships. They're generally very good communicators. They understand boundaries. They're very good with conflict. And they also understand the concepts of I can be good on my own. I'm good when I'm independent, and I'm also good when we're interdependent, right? When we're together. So I have a balance of needs of being alone and also togetherness. So that's sort of the utopia, right, of what we're aiming for. Should I stop here and ask if there's any questions about secure attachment?
Oh, no, this is really interesting because I'm thinking like, man, so is it possible for for children who grow up in a household where there's divorce to be secure despite the fact that their parents, may have had, some maybe discussions or arguments, but still ended the marriage okay? Or does that mean that every kid that, because most people have this idea of like, if you had divorce in a marriage and your kids saw it, there was probably some conflict that they saw that may not be healthy for kids. And I know there's this also a stigma and misconceptions about that. So yeah, what would you say to that?
It's an excellent question. It's a prevalent question. So there are a lot of factors to consider when it comes to divorce. First of all, how the age of the kids, right? So kids are most susceptible to their early attachment patterns from 0 to 5, right? But anywhere up until 12 is definitely impactful, but from 0 to 5. Now, there are divorces whereby it's not acrimonious. I could speak about my own divorce. My ex-husband and I are still very good friends. Yes, there were arguments, but there were never shouting matches. There were never name calling. There was never disrespect, especially in front of the children. And we had a talk with them. My kids were teenagers when we separated. And, we explained to them that we love each other, but just not in the romantic sense. And so there is always an opportunity to position it as a learning experience, right? So I would never say that if a child experiences a divorce, they absolutely are going to have an insecure attachment style. Not at all. Now, what's more important is how the parents navigate the dynamic of that changing of the household, right? If the children continue to be cared for and comforted for and given opportunities to speak, and the parents continue to remain emotionally attuned as much as they can be, because clearly they're under stress at that time, usually the child will fare very well.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's not an A plus B equals C equation at all. And the same would be true of, we know from statistics that there's zero correlation to say that all children that come out of homes, two-parent homes that didn't experience divorce, are securely attached.
Mhm.
That is untrue as well.
Okay. Yeah.
So what we're really doing is we're talking about the emotional attunement that a parent has towards the child. Now I'm going to move into the insecure realm, and I think you'll see sort of some of the examples that'll bring out what I'm really talking about, right? What actually starts to drive a child into a more insecure pattern, right? Where they feel unsafe. So, again, we talked about two primary ways that when a child develops an insecure attachment because they didn't receive that predictable emotional attunement from their parent, they could either become avoidant in nature or anxious in nature. So the person who becomes anxious in nature, this is usually as a result of a parent who is quite unpredictable. So one day they're loving and the next day they're not loving. A father who is one day emotionally available and the next day not there. The core wound there that the child ends up developing is, I will be abandoned, right? And so they start developing a series of, we at that time we call it parent pleasing gestures and behaviors to seek the attention, the reassurance, the validation of the parents, because they have received some love from the parents and they know it feels good. Every child desires the love of their parents and attention, but they have also received where the parent has pulled away that attention, not always even punitively, right? It's just, maybe one of the parents has a mental illness, right? And one day they're loving and the next day they're not feeling well. Maybe there's alcoholism in the family. Maybe one parent is traveling a lot for work. It's not that the parent is trying to cause harm, but to a very young child, they don't understand why one day mommy is here and the next day she isn't.
Right.
So that starts to become concerning to the child. And so what the child does is they start to become overly congenial, right? They become parent pleasers. And the idea is that they want to become really likable. In the thought process of a child, if I'm so likable, you'll never leave me.
Oh, that's dangerous because I can see how
Yeah,
that can be.
exactly. And so the core wounds, that type of person that child will grow up with can be a series of things. I will be abandoned. I am unlikable. I will be excluded. I am unworthy. I will be alone. All of these things. And you can see how that might start to play out in a romantic context. So these individuals, very interesting. They actually really, really enjoy being around other people. Part of it is because they never developed the ability to self soothe. So they're overly reliant on the input from external sources. They don't trust themselves. They don't trust themselves. They afford trust to a lot of other people. And so they're generally feeling their nervous system in a calm, relaxed state when they're around a lot of people. So they love family gatherings. They're usually the ones who are creating the big holiday parties. They're usually in professions where they're surrounded by people all day long. Like we see them often become teachers. Kids, people all day long, right?
Right.
And so we actually see these traits sort of following us even in the professions that we choose, right? And so for this cohort of people being alone, because the I will be abandoned core wound is so strong, even being alone for a Saturday evening, let's say plans get canceled, that just feels really threatening to them.
Wow.
Really threatening. They're likely to just go out to a bar themselves and hope to find a few friends hanging out. Spending a night alone at home for them is like, so when they get into relationships, they often, we see this very often, they bounce from relationship to relationship to relationship. They have a very hard time being single.
Mhm.
They often chase emotionally unavailable partners, which is generally a dynamic that they learned early in childhood, where they got sort of breadcrumbs, maybe from one of their parents, right?
Mhm.
They got attention sometimes and sometimes they didn't. So they got used to sort of chasing after little bits of attention and affection. And that's what formed their template for this is love.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that
Yes.
was the anxious attachment. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
anxious attachment. And we will see this in even very, very young children. So if you pay attention, because we said 0 to 5 is where you get your biggest imprint. So the next time you're in a grocery store, pay attention to the relationship that a young child has as they're shopping with, let's say, their mom, and they're sitting in the cart. Now, pay attention to the interaction. The child that is constantly seeking attention, validation, pulling at the mummy's skirt, constantly yelling, throwing tantrums, demanding something, very clingy. These are all signs of anxious attachment really early.
Can that change before the age of
Yes.
5?
So, by the age of 5, it's that pattern is set. As we get older and we have the ability to understand our minds and critical thought, we can identify these patterns. We can then consciously recognize I'm still living in these patterns, although I'm no longer living in my home of origin, right? And we can change these patterns. The mind is incredibly malleable, just like any part of the body. Like if I decide, in 2026, I'm going to add 5 pounds of muscle to my frame. I want to get stronger, right? That's my goal. I can absolutely do that, but I need a plan. I need commitment. I need to go 3 times a week. So it's not just going to happen because I go on a random Tuesday and I lift, a little bit of weights with a plan and a structure and a set of exercises, I can absolutely change my physical body. I can absolutely change my mind as well. It's just as malleable.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's mind blowing because it's
Yeah.
such a young age. And if you're not aware of these attachment styles, then as a parent, I'm thinking, have I impacted my child? And I wish I would have known this sooner when they were little, because 18, 19 now. But I'm thinking of moments where maybe there was one of my kids who were really, really attached and didn't like being away from me. And then the other one could care less. And I'm
Hmm.
thinking now, like, what did I do?
Common.
And what was it me? Or, I mean, I'm sure that there's also other external factors, but it's definitely good to pay attention to that. And I'm pretty sure that even though now they're 18 and 19, I probably still trigger some of that, right? Like you're always influencing other people, regardless of what attachment they grew up with.
You are, but and my children are about the same age as yours, a few years older, but now is the wonderful time in life where you can sit down and have real conversations. I remember it wasn't long ago, maybe last year, I sat down with my older son, who's almost 22, and I said to him, I know I didn't do everything perfectly as a mom. I know that there were moments I was so overwhelmed and I wanted to be more present and I wasn't. And I know that there were times that I lost my shit and I wish that I would have kept it together. But I just, in the moment didn't do so well. And he looked at me and he said, "You did pretty good most of the time." And I was like, "Okay, that's good. Like most of the time is what you're aiming for." But I said to him, what is it that you wish that I would have focused more on or focused less on? Or, what would it you think would have made a difference? And I encourage you to ask your sons, your kids, the same question because at 18, 19, 20, they have the ability to reflect. And I think the answer might surprise you.
Yeah.
My son said to me, Mom, you didn't need to try so hard. And I said, What do you mean? He goes, I just remember like my birthday would roll around and you would spend like 3 days in the kitchen baking this perfect 3-layer cake themed. He goes, you could have gone to the store and just bought the cake and spent 3 days hanging out with me.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, you're so right.
Yeah.
I could have. You're so right. And I think back now, why did I do that? Because my conditioning, my attachment style taught me that I needed to earn my love, that perfectionism, I needed to perform. And so I was doing what I thought I needed to do without realizing the impact. What our children really need from us is not that perfectly baked 3-layer cake. They need our presence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, and to your point, we all just do our best and we have to
mhm,
accept. I think it was hard for me to accept that I was just not that perfect mother that I wanted to be. The perfectionism part of me just was too hard on myself. And then I had a similar conversation with my kids about how was I, because my thing was I just want them to have a really good childhood where they will look back and not have like cringe moments or regrets or like stories of
of
suffering
course.
because mine was like that. But yeah, but let's move on to the dismissive avoidant is the next one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, I just wanted to tell you, he was over on the weekend because they're both away at college now, but he was over on the weekend and he said something to me so interesting. He's like, it's been a while since you made one of those chocolate chip banana cakes that you used to make all the time. And I was like, I think you're right. I'm like, are you in the mood for a chocolate chip banana cake? He's like, I think I am. And so
Oh,
we sat and we baked a cake together.
oh, that's so sweet. I love that.
Which I mean, I did most of the baking, right? But he wanted a moment of nostalgia,
Yeah.
right? Which was so sweet. So that made me feel good.
Yeah, that's
But,
awesome.
anyways,
Yeah.
okay. So now we have the child who's overly anxious to their primary attacher, right? The other way that a child can go if they don't get that emotional attunement is they can become avoidantly attached, right? So this is generally seen in a home where a child is emotionally neglected or overly controlled. They have identified that closeness, intimacy is scary or painful. So a lot of the time, these children are dismissed. They're left alone a lot. Think about the baby who cries and nobody comes to get them. And that's been refuted now. I know there was they let them cry, the Ferber, the baby, I think it was called. I don't even know. The Ferber method with that all mothers used at one point. That's been debunked as actually psychologically quite damaging. A
Wow.
child absolutely really needs the connection to their primary caregiver that could be mother, father, and grandmother, whoever the child sees as their primary caregiver, they need that connection. And when they cry, which is really their only way of communicating, they need to know that they can get comfort, that they have safety, that they'll be listened to, that they'll be responded to in a healthy way. So children who are emotionally neglected, and there's so many different scenarios, right? So it could be a household, for example, where there's too many children in the house, right? To just that child is just left unseen. The parents can simply be way too busy or, consumed with other things. Maybe there's illness in the family or whatnot. Oftentimes we see this, where one child is ill and gets all the attention and the rest of the children are sort of neglected, right? Because there's only so much attention you can give, right? We see this in homes that the parents are very stoic, meaning emotions are not shown, right? So it's, you know, you have 3 meals a day and a hot bed to sleep in, but there's no I love yous, there's no hugs. We see this often in high demand religions
Mhm.
where children are not hugged, they're not given that love, they're there to perform, they're there as a function. There are lots of scenarios whereby children are emotionally neglected, where we're not attuned. There's also some scenarios very common with a mother and sometimes their son, where it's a form of exaggerated enmeshment, where there's not, I would say, simple boundaries between the mother and the son. So sometimes a child is parentified and asked to behave in a way that is above their years of maturity. So a single mother might use her son as sort of a surrogate spouse emotionally and talk about her problems psychologically. If the mother is unwell, the child often becomes the caregiver. This will, all of these different types of scenarios, there are lots of them, will often result in a child who develops an avoidant attachment style. And what that means is they become hyper independent. They learn their lesson early on that they only have themselves to depend on,
So what
right?
about, I'm sorry, but what about like athletes? You know how athletes have so much pressure to perform so well. I'm thinking because I hear all these stories of, oh, my parents just wanted me to do this and this, and there's not enough time for that personal attachment, but in a way they're pleasing at the same time. So I'm like, would that be anxious or would that be dismissive? Because all they're focusing is on the performance of the sport and not so much the
Hold on to that question for a moment,
okay.
because we're
Yeah.
gonna we're gonna hit another category which might fall better.
Okay.
Because again, we're talking about the relationship that they have to their primary caregiver. There are a lot of both my children were very athletic. So there are a lot of parents who are extremely encouraging. And so they're not impacted negatively as they go through their athletic careers. Now, there are plenty of examples where parents are absolutely abusive and punitive towards their children when they don't perform, right? We've heard about the Venus sisters, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Am I saying that right? The
Venus
Williams
and
sisters.
the
Sorry, the Williams
yeah,
sisters. Yeah,
Serena and
Venus is her
Venus.
first name. Yeah, the father was really difficult towards them. We know, this is, I don't know if you're into true crime. I won't get off too much onto a tangent, but true crime is all about really how we treat one another, right? True crime is all about psychology. And there's a very famous case of two athletes who killed their parents back in the 80s, the Menendez brothers. They were both hardcore tennis players and they killed their parents. Now, that was a question of abuse. If for one of the if for example, one child didn't perform that day, the father would physically abuse the child, physically harm and punish the child for not performing on the court. That mixed in with the sport is very different from a parent who goes, "You didn't have your best game, but tomorrow will be a different day."
Okay.
So we can't simply just say, what about kids who are going, who are sort of at the top echelon of their sport. It depends on their support system, and it doesn't all look the same. So the dismissive avoidant person really learns to live life on their own little island. They are very uncomfortable with conflict. They're very slow to warm up to other people. They don't trust other people because they learned that I can't rely on my caregivers to meet my needs. So I'm not going to be able to rely on anyone else. It's really me, myself, and I. And so they have sort of a wall up. They're difficult to get close to emotionally. It's very difficult for them to experience vulnerability because they learned in childhood. Oftentimes, if they showed vulnerability, they were punished, right? Or criticized or whatever else. And so these people have a very hard time when they grow up getting into relationships. In fact, they often choose not to. These are the people that we see in the dating pool that often choose to entertain situationships. And they're the ones that let's just see where it goes. And because they don't want to commit. Their biggest fear is having to absorb someone else's emotional compass. They don't want you to rely on them like their mother once did, for example, for emotional support, right? It doesn't feel good to them. They need a tremendous amount of alone time. Whereas the anxious person loves being surrounded by people, the avoidant person avoids mostly other people, avoids conflict, avoids intimacy, vulnerability, and they prefer to be alone. And so these are the two different spheres that can generally emerge in general terms when a child is not given that emotional consistency. Now, there is a third sphere, which is the fearful avoidant, which is a mix of some traits of the avoidant attacher and some traits of the anxious attacher. In the literature, it's called disorganized attacher. It's the same thing, fearful avoidant, disorganized, and generally, people will develop this particular attachment style when there's abuse in the home, right? Or, a high degree of conflict where it really felt unsafe. And, if you look at it from a child's perspective, the reason that they become disorganized in their way to attach to someone is because as a child, let's say I'm talking about my father, right? A little girl will look at her father like he's the one that brought the sun out in the morning, right? Like she's the best thing ever. And so the little girl is always seeking the father's reassurance, attention, validation, all of that comfort. But in some situations, that person who is the only person who offers that level of comfort to the child is also harming the child. So physically, psychologically, emotionally, could be sexually. And so the child becomes disorganized in their thought pattern between wanting to get close to this person because they bring me comfort and also being petrified to get close to them because they also harm me.
Mhm.
So they oscillate between coming close and backing up and coming close and backing up. And when they grow into adults, they often get coined as the hot and the cold partner,
Oh,
right? So one day they're hot, one day they're cold. And that's because they don't fully trust themselves, but they also don't fully trust other people.
mhm.
So these patterns are, I would say, really pervasive for how it is that we feel about ourselves and how we experience the world for many, many years after we leave our home of origin.
Yeah. Wow. This is very intricate. It sounds like,
It's really, really detailed. It's layered.
yeah. Because as I'm
Yeah.
thinking, I'm like, oh my gosh. So what about submissive people? Do they usually fall into one of these categories, or could they not? Like very, very confident people love to be around a lot of people, and so you describe that as one of the attachment styles, because they need that validation from everybody. It was like, but that's not necessarily always the case where there's something wrong with them. Sometimes that's just heck, they could have ADHD or like something else too, So it,
Yeah, there's like humans are complex, right? It's never one thing. And
right.
usually you fall into one primary category. You could have a secondary category too. But I want to be clear that this is not identifying certain personality traits. So you talked about someone who's submissive. So being submissive is a personality trait, right? So that's not necessarily defined by your attachment style, right? So we often see submission as a strategy that's used by people who are anxiously attached to try to stave off the threat of someone leaving. This is fawning. So there's four different threat responses, right? When you feel threatened, your nervous system feels threatened. Everyone knows about fight or flight, but there's two others. It's fight or flight, freeze, and fawn. Fawn is people pleasing. And when we talked about the young child who goes into parent pleaser mode, they then grow up and they become the people pleaser. So, someone who's highly submissive, who does things that they don't necessarily want to do, but they do it as a strategy to please someone else, if they're doing it because they're staving off the threat that the other person will abandon them, then that is a strategy they're adopting to appease their attachment style.
Wow.
That does not mean that everyone who is submissive is doing that.
Yeah.
Some people are submissive in a situation, like, for example, my partner will say to me, "What do you want to have for dinner tonight?" And I'm submissive because I truly don't care. I'm like, I don't care. Not because I'm trying to please him, but because food doesn't excite me. So it's whatever you want is good, right? So we have to look at the motivations behind. And you're absolutely right. Some people have ADHD, they're neurodivergent, right? That's a factor. So we don't look at this, it's always multifactorial.
Yeah. So if people want to work with you, what does that look like? And should they go to your website and take that quiz first and then reach
Yeah.
out? Or how does
Yeah, that's a great place. So my website is securelyloved.com. If you want to learn about your own attachment style or read up about attachment styles, please go ahead and do that. I think it's a good place of awareness. We also I'm starting up a YouTube channel where I try to put a lot of this information out there because I think people should know this. The YouTube channel is also called Securely Loved. And we're on Instagram at securely_loved. So come visit us. I do one-on-one counseling with individuals. I work with both men and women, and I work with couples and families too.
Oh, that's great. Well, there you go. That this has been so fascinating. If we had a lot more time, I'd ask more questions. Believe me, I have a ton of them. But but for the sake of saving time today, I just want to say thank you so much. This has been extremely valuable. Just from a parent's perspective, I just see how important it is to look within and see where you fall in because like you said we all have a type and it's important to understand what that type is so we know how to communicate and navigate the world with others.
Yeah, and just a final thought. You already mentioned it, but I kind of want to punctuate it as we close out. You can change your attachment style, which means if you've noticed that you're kind of avoidant in situations, you can learn to operate in a more secure way. So it's not a life sentence where you're like, okay, this is just the way I am. No, we can absolutely learn, different ways to rewire our brain and different behavioral patterns.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bev. This has been amazing.
Hey, did you like that episode? I have an ask. Would you mind leaving me a review? It would really help me improve this podcast so that you can come back and keep listening. Also, don't forget to check me out at DaliTalks.com and follow me on social media at DaliTalks. Until next time.